Well, 7 months after the UFC made its long-awaited debut at the world's most famous arena, it's now Bellator's turn to run Madison Square Garden. We are less than 24 hours away from Bellator 180 and Bellator NYC. We're in the heart of Manhattan, a big moment for Bellator MMA. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani. That, of course, is the man in the hat, Chuck Mindenhall. We are here for the MMAfighting.com preview show. And Chuck, like I said, less than 24 hours away. This is a big moment for not only the company, but for Viacom. Scott Coker, promoter of 3 decades, finally getting to run a show at Madison Square Garden. And like I said, here we are, just a few hours away. Do you feel a buzz in the city? You were at UFC 205, and I know it's not really fair to compare it to Conor McGregor, but how do you compare it?
Yeah, it's kind of not fair because if you remember that one, we were carried away. We were carried away a little bit on the.
Welcome to New York.
We were carried away a little bit by the Irish on that one, and there were a lot of Irish people here. But you know, there's a fair amount of buzz around the city. In the proximity here, obviously the Fighter Hotel is really close to this and everything, and there's been quite a few fans, and I thought it was there was some nice little moments in the weigh-ins there too. So it's not quite the same buzz, but I feel like it's got a little something going on.
The painfully long weigh-ins that just would not. And so the headlining act, of course, is Sonnen versus Wanderlei Silva. In the co-main event, we have Fedor versus Matt Mitrione. But let me ask you this: of the main, 5 or 6 fights, which jumps out at you? Which is the one that you're most interested in?
Definitely the Lorenz Larkin Douglas Lima fight. I mean, for a lot of reasons. Anytime you can get a guy who's coming over and that partition comes down, so you get to see him against some of the other talent, that's always fun. But then you get a guy like Douglas Lima who's had 8 knockouts out of 10 wins in Bellator, and he's facing a guy where both guys like to knock each other out, and he hasn't had a ton of eyeballs on him, man. And it's just one of those situations you think, finally, we're going to see him in a different light, maybe to boost his stock, because you could look at his resume and make an easy. You could say he's in the top. That's some of the top welterweights in the world, but I don't feel like people really regard him that way. So I feel like this is also great for him to get that exposure and get this kind of fight. And I would probably say also like the Chandler fight, just given what he's able to do, and we know how he's been thinking. He seems really focused, and you take a guy like Brent Primus, who's probably it's like one of these weird guys, but he seems determined because of this big spotlight and everything. So that one's got me more intrigued as time has gone on.
How have you felt about just kind of the heat, the buzz leading up to Sonnen and Silva? Because they have this long history, because they have the moments, in Tough Brazil and the brawl and everything. Has it lived up to what you thought it was going to be?
What's funny is I think I just lost my expectations for it a long time ago. So I don't know really where those were. I would have to say that I was probably going into that particular fight with the bar pretty low. Primarily because, Wanderlei Silva has not been in the cage for so long, and Chael Sonnen did not look very good in his last fight. He's had this, this propensity of late to maybe give up a little bit in his fights, and I'm hoping that's not the case. He says he's motivated and everything for this fight, but when you put those two things together, the really competitive spirit of it and just how many question marks go into it, it hasn't really registered beyond that. It kicked up a little bit, obviously, yesterday when they, there's a little shove going on in the press conference and everything like that, but on whole, I still feel like it's there. You see those guys, they're running those packages. You see Chael Sonnen, you can't help but think, oh man, that's Chael Sonnen. It's hard to believe I'm not more excited about that. Or you see Wanderlei Silva, you think, wow, I can't believe he's back. But it's not quite. It feels foster. It feels like I'm fostering that enthusiasm. It's just not inherent to the fight.
Part of me kind of wishes it was the co-main event and there was a big title fight as the main. Kind of taking some of the pressure away from those two guys. Who intrigues you more? Like, who are there more question marks surrounding? Wanderlei, who hasn't fought in 4+ years, or Chael, who really did not look good in that Bellator debut back in January?
I think it's got to be Chael.
Really?
Because Wanderlei, just in the last time we saw him, of course, it's been a long time. I mean, he was still Wanderlei Silva on some level. And I feel like Chael, though, we're getting diminishing returns after the fact, too. And I think he's the one. Because obviously, for him to be the talker that he is and the promoter that he is and everything, it's contingent on him winning some fights too. And I feel like if he doesn't beat Wanderlei after all of this, or if he doesn't put on at least a good showing, who knows how much that's going to damage him ultimately. Because I feel like people already, like I was saying, you start to lose some of the sheen off of Chael Sonnen. Because there was a time when you were magnetized by the whole thing, and I feel like we're not there anymore. But I feel like if he puts on a great performance and just looks like himself and gets on the mic and does something great, he might, we might see a little bit of resurgence with him again. So this is a big pivot fight for him that way.
And when I also consider the fact that, Chael's doing some broadcast work for them, you want I would think from a Bellator perspective for him to go long. Not that they're so much rooting for him, but I feel like they have more invested in Chael at this point, right?
For sure. And I mean, they're only going to get this fight, and they've, you know, this fight has been talked about for so long. You're only going to get it once. And I will say that I'm happy, and I'm almost afraid to even talk about it, but I'm happy that at this moment, whatever time it is on this the day before the fight, that it's still on, because there was a big part of me that wondered what would happen to this fight beforehand, how it would fall apart. So I'm happy that it's happening, and I would agree with you. I think that Chael, if you're, you know, they always say they don't have rooting interest, but there's a lot more to gain if Chael Sonnen is victorious.
Who wins?
Man, because of the way Chael has looked, and I still question his motivation on whole, even though he's saying different things, I'm kind of leaning towards Wanderlei Silva. There's a part of me that just thinks that, you know, he connects on something. Maybe Chael does this. He goes in for that scoops in for that double leg or something. It gets caught, and it just kind of ends in that sense. That's kind of the way I'm seeing it. So I'm gonna go Wanderlei Silva. I've kind of flip-flopped early, but I think that's where I'm at on it now.
You know, one thing to consider when you consider Chael's, you know, miserable debut back in January, that deal came together quickly. The deal to come over to Bellator, and then the subsequent booking. Also, you know, he suffered this family tragedy with the passing of his daughter. I feel like there was a lot of pressure on him, and we were kind of thinking that he would be the Chael of old. This time around, I don't know if you agree, he looks to be in better shape. It just feels like maybe this is the real debut, and that was the rush debut. Maybe this is the real debut. We shall find out on Saturday. Let me ask you about the co-main event. It's Fedor Emelianenko versus Matt Mitrione, and it has been a while since we saw Fedor. Around a year, and that fight was against Fabio Maldonado, and he did not look good. Remember, most people were saying they wanted him to retire after that. This fight was supposed to happen in February. Mitrione gets the kidney stones. They delay it. I feel like this is an intriguing fight, but I'm wondering if you agree with this sentiment. You know, I don't know how many Fedor fights you've covered in the past in person. Have you covered any?
Quite a few, yeah.
Does it feel like those? Does it feel like the Strikeforce ones, you know, the CBS ones, or have things changed a little bit?
Well, it's definitely changed, because because I saw him in Affliction a couple times. I saw him in Strikeforce a couple times. For most of those fights, there was this sheen of invincibility. I still think that attached to him. It's kind of, maybe, I wouldn't go quite as far as the Conor McGregor thing, but there was a more of that vibe to him, where it was, you're looking at this once-in-a-lifetime kind of guy, having survived for whatever it is, a decade without losing. So I felt like that was there, and it was also just his demeanor, just of the fact that you realized, seeing him in America and everything, how deliberate and stoic he is, you know, and seeing this. And I would say that there's still a big part of that, because he has not changed in the slightest. I mean, they did the montage up there, and they're kind of showing him knock guys out, and just this cool kind of dead stare, and it all comes back. I always remember, like in Hoffman Estates, I think it was, the first time I seen him in Strikeforce, and I just remember that when he knocked out Brett Rogers, and it stuck with me, the kind of bedlam that felt like at that moment, because you know, he was kind of getting beat up, but then he just lands that big shot, and it just was such a vintage fight. I think there's a big part of us that wants to see that Fedor, you know, because there's almost a nostalgia in play when we talk about him. So I feel like that's where his vibe is at this point, going into it. Probably a lot of people want to see that a little bit, but I think there's a big caution to it too.
Does he get it done?
I don't think so, man. I think Matt Mitrione, I mean, you just look at Matt Mitrione, I also think he's in a good space. Like, he just seems, after the whole thing that happened last time, there's a little bit of question, though, about, because I know he's raised a couple of red flags about his training and everything like that. So you wonder a little bit, like, well, maybe he's not taking it as seriously as he should, but I still think that he's got his power and his quickness, you know, for his size and everything, will translate against a guy who's leaves his chin out there like Fedor does.
So you think he knocks him out?
I do.
Wow.
Yeah.
That would be an interesting sight. Yeah. Especially, they're expecting a big Russian crowd here. Yeah. So many Russians live in nearby Brooklyn. So let me ask you about Michael Chandler and Brent Primus. You briefly spoke about that fight, but yesterday Michael Chandler said to me that he believes he's the best lightweight in the world. And that's not a crazy statement. He's obviously going to say that, but it kind of got me thinking about the lightweight division, because it's so in flux right now in the UFC. And if you're going to compare him to the top 5 in the UFC, would you put Michael Chandler, for those that don't know all that much about him, in the Tony Ferguson, you know, Khabib, Nate Diaz, Eddie Alvarez territory, or is he below that?
It's always a difficult one. I could see him in that company, though, to be honest, because he's just such a gym rat guy, you know, and he has so much to his skill set, and, you know, seeing him knock out. That was at St. Louis when he was fighting Freer.
Tricky,
He knocks him out, and I was there for that, and I was like, you just
one of the best knockouts I've ever seen.
One of those big
clean.
Then what he's, you know, the Benson Henderson thing. I mean, you see him handle himself like that, and it's kind of hard to argue that he belongs in that company. But the guys you're talking about are also just at the height of their games too. So it's one of those conversations that they're fun ultimately. But I certainly wouldn't say that he doesn't belong in that that company. You know what I mean? Maybe he would be a notch below because of who those guys have fought versus who he fought. But I'd put him up there with those guys.
He took exception with another MMA outlet who had Justin Gaethje ranked above him because of who he's fought and who Gaethje's fought. But you can't help but think about his experiences with Will Brooks, and Will Brooks hasn't had the easiest time in the UFC.
True.
You hate to play that kind of MMA math. Without a doubt, though, he's one of the faces of Bellator. He's one of their most exciting fighters. I kind of think they should have put him on the Spike TV prelims. I've talked about this just because he's always a very exciting fighter. Do you think Brent Primus can get it done, or is Chandler just too good and too experienced?
I mean, anything can happen, obviously, but I think that I would look for signs of complacency maybe from Chandler, but I just don't see it right now. He went through that skid like you were mentioning, and I felt like he was probably damaged on some level, his confidence or something, because he just looks different to me and he comports himself differently. I think he's focused on, I think he's loving this big stage, and I think that he feels like a personal pride in Bellator, and he's helping bring this thing here, and I think all those things factor into him wanting to showcase. I don't think he's going to slip against Brent Primus.
Now wait a second, do not adjust your monitor. We have just changed locations. It started to rain on us, as happens here in New York and other places. It's a natural thing, and our equipment started to get wet. So now here we are resuming the preview show, but just under some kind of canopy over here at Madison Square Garden so that we don't break all our equipment. Let us resume, Chuck.
Where were we?
Lorenz Larkin, you mentioned that fight against Douglas Lima for the welterweight title. You talked about your interest in it. Who's going to win?
Yeah, I'm giving the nod actually to Lima on this. I think he looks at it. I think he looks at this as something that he's kind of been waiting for, and you can tell he's appreciative, I think, of this moment. And besides all that, man, you talked to Larkin a little bit, and he seemed a little confident in himself that, I'm coming over here. I've seen guys like him before. I'm not overly worried about what he brings, and that sort of thing. And that to me is always like one of those, that's a little bit scary considering he's so good at his kicks and his punches and how much power he's packing on him. So I think I'm leaning towards Lima on this one.
And of course, there's a big pod at the end of this rainbow. His name, of course, is one Rory McDonald. So it's going to be interesting to see if any of the fighters are looking past. This is a big moment for them, but undoubtedly a fight against Rory McDonald is even bigger. So I'm looking forward to that one as well. One last one on the pay-per-view, and it's a big one. It's the debut of Aaron Pico. He meets Zach Freeman. And I got to say, I just look at Aaron Pico, and the guy just oozes superstardom, the way he dresses, the way he conducts himself, but more importantly, the way he trains. I mean, yes, he hasn't fought professionally yet, but we've never seen a wrestler of his caliber, pretty much an Olympian. I mean, this close to making the Olympic team as a teenager with his kind of boxing skills. I mean, he really has it all. He is the Prodigy 2.0, in my opinion. Do you share my enthusiasm about his debut? I haven't been this excited about a debut in a long time.
I share every bit of your enthusiasm, and it's funny because he's one of those guys we keep talking about now. The generations are coming up way more immersed in the whole of mixed martial arts, and he's one of those kids that you think he can do all of it right away. He carries himself that way. He carries himself like a veteran. He's not intimidated by this stage. He went up there today. What was it he said? He's like, I was here for 2 reasons: to sell tickets and to
knock people out.
I mean, he knows who he's training with. He's got a great corner. You know that those guys are going to keep him grounded. But ultimately, I just think that he's got that star quality, man. Like, you can tell those guys when they come up sometimes that their belief in themselves is just a matter of time until we all see why they have that belief, and this will be step one.
And I love how this story unfolds. Bellator signed him 2.5 years ago, and for his debut to converge with the debut at Madison Square Garden, I mean, you couldn't write a script better than this for both Bellator and Pico. They've done a nice job of finding talent who aren't quite ready to fight on the big stage as professionals, but invest time in him, almost like I have a farm system within the system, and now hopefully it will pay dividends.
And it's interesting because we've seen like Terrell Fortune and Ed Root kind of ushered very fast through a prelim fight where there's no pressure and nothing like that. And this is a completely different circumstance. They brought him up in a different way, and he's only 20 years old, and he's going against a guy who's 8-2. It's not like he's a slouch. Obviously, he's not a big name in the sport, but they're not putting him against a guy with a 1-3 record or something like that, where you think it's just a cupcake. I think the setting is really nice for him, man, and it's been fun to see him in person and to see kind of how he interacts with the media and handles himself in these situations. So far, man, it's all been gold for him so far.
And to echo your point, I mean, Zach Freeman in his last fight fought for the RFA title.
Yeah.
I mean, again, he's no scrub. You spent some time with him.
Yeah.
I have to say, I really enjoyed him at the press conference, just the way he was pitching himself to the Viacom execs. His day job, I think, selling windows or something like that.
Yes.
But he is an opponent, right? I mean, let's be honest, they want Pico to win.
I love it when those guys get the chance because you feel like he's an everyman who just all of a sudden is like, well, one day I woke up and I'm fighting at Madison Square Garden. But he understands why he's here. He understands that it's all about Pico. Let's put it this way. I feel like there's a lot unsaid of what he's feeling. I feel like if he was a spring and upset or something, we would hear a completely different side of him. But I do believe him. You know, I think this is just a great opportunity, and this is something he can tell his grandkids about. How do you not like that sort of story? You know what I mean? Even if he comes out, you know, on the losing end.
Now, before I let you go, I have to ask you about the headlining act on the Spike TV card. It's Ryan Bader's debut against Phil Davis for the light heavyweight title. They fought a couple years ago in Sweden. It was somewhat of a dull affair. I was there at 3 in the morning. Yes, it was not the kind of fight that you want to watch at 3 in the morning. Do you think this one will be just as 5 rounds, or do you think that they'll try to do something special because of the criticism? Bader's debut, Davis champion now.
I think it's going to go differently. I really do. Well, Phil Davis has looked more exciting since he's come over to Bellator. That's just my opinion. I mean, he's had some finishes, and I feel like he's just looked better on whole. And then you look at a guy like Bader, and you know, some of his big contentions, which he shared with you, is just the archaic notion of all these, you know, prizes at the end of the fight. You know, you can win bonuses and all that stuff. Well, he did away with all that, I think, really so that he could load up on his power and fight the way he wants to fight, rather than revert to his wrestling. And that's really stuck with me when he talked about that, because I feel like I've always felt like he wanted to do that kind of fight, but as soon as he loses bearings again, he knew he was going back down. But you knew he could beat a guy by wrestling. He doesn't have to do that, and I think he understands that. And to me, that's just going to translate into him trying to win the fight with his hands.
So who wins? Does he do it?
I think
Bader.
I think he does.
Wow.
I think he does.
Wait, you're talking about Davis?
I'm talking about Bader.
You're talking about Bader.
I think he's going to come in and, I don't know, it's more of a gut feeling. I think that they both have so many, you know, they can neutralize each other's strengths in so many ways, and both guys can knock each other out. Both guys can put each other in trouble quickly. But there's just a gut feeling. I think that Bader, you know, coming over, a new stage, getting this kind of opportunity for a belt, I could see it switching hands pretty easily. I've always liked Ryan Bader. I just like the fact that he has a different mentality right now going into this fight.
Very much looking forward to that. That's the main event of the Bellator 180 Spike TV main card that will also feature the Bellator debut, as far as broadcasting is concerned, of one Mike Goldberg, the longtime voice of the UFC, now a member of the Bellator TV family, and on the pay-per-view it'll be the Bellator TV debut of Mauro Ranallo. There's so much going on here, and we can argue all day long as to whether or not this is a pay-per-view worthy card. They're expecting a very good crowd, around 10 to 12,000 people. Their best gate ever, their highest gate ever, maybe close to 2 million if all goes well, some walk-up sales. But here's what we can't argue. This is a fact, in my opinion. This is the deepest card in Bellator history, because not only are we getting those fights, we're also getting James Gallagher versus Shinzo Machida. You're getting Naaman Gracie versus Dave Marfone. You're getting some really solid cards. Ryan Couture versus Chaim Ghazali. So it's, and lest I forget the debut of one Heather Hardy, who is a big star here in the New York area, 20-0 as a professional boxer, a multiple-time champion, making the transition over to MMA.
When's the last time you heard a pop for a prelim fight like Gallagher got? Man, that was insane. They broke out into a chant. I was like, it's just a small faction of what McGregor gets, but I was like, wow, there they are showing up.
The times they are changing for Bellator. Another chapter in their history is written tomorrow night here at the world's most famous arena. We shall be there with our usual fight night coverage. Can't wait for that. But for now, we shall say goodbye. For our crew here, thanks so much for watching our coverage up until this point. Can't wait for Saturday. For Chuck, I'm Ariel. Appreciate your time. Enjoy the fights. We'll talk to you afterwards.